Gender Studies major at Athabasca University. I'm going to be talking to you today about abortion and its relation to the control and oppression of sexualities, the maintenance of heteronormativity, and how abortion restrictions work to uphold the powers of the patriarchy. Abortion restrictions are detrimental to the health, safety, and well-being of many people, not just cis women. Please note that if and when I use the word woman, I am including all persons who require accessible, affordable, and medically accurate access to reproductive health care. This includes trans individuals, women of color, Indigenous women, and LGBTQ2SAI+ persons. Prior to Confederation, Canada operated under the same abortion laws as Great Britain. All forms of abortion and birth control were illegal. Anyone procuring an abortion and performing an abortion faced life in prison. However, there was a growing commercial market for so-called medicinal remedies, which allowed those who had the funds a non-surgical option. These were advertised as treating menstrual irregularities, although it was common knowledge what else they could be used for. For those with less financial resources, there were so-called back alley abortionists, who for a price performed dangerous surgical procedures to terminate pregnancies. It is estimated that, at that time, 1 in 3 women who underwent non-medicinal abortions died from the procedure. It was generally racialized and working-class women who did not have the funds to access either. In 1869, Canada put into place its own criminal code, and abortions were made completely illegal, as did the sale, distribution, and advertisement of contraception or abortion options. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, impoverished, racialized, and working-class women had to continue seeking back alley abortions, but further criminalization, lack of medical options, and ongoing poverty made such procedures more dangerous, secretive, expensive, and inaccessible. Rarely, therapeutic abortions were performed in hospitals, but generally only on elitist, upper-class women under the guise of another legal procedure such as an emergency appendectomy. In the 20th century, the use of that therapeutic abortion loophole became more common. The laws had not changed, the procedures became, quote, common law, and had become socially acceptable, but again only under certain circumstances. Physicians had to obtain support from their superiors and other physicians, as well as, quote, formal consent of the husbands or fathers, end quote. Note here that it is not the wishes of the woman that mattered, but rather the consent of male practitioners and male family members. In 1969, the Canadian government reformed the criminal code to decriminalize abortions in the first 12 weeks of pregnancy. After 12 weeks, abortions would only be legal if the pregnancy threatened the health of the woman or if the expected child would be born, quote, greatly handicapped, end quote, either mentally or physically. This procedure could only be done by a trained physician in a hospital. A committee of at least 3, usually male, doctors also had to approve the abortion as necessary to protect the life or physical health of the pregnant person. Mental health or economic status were not taken into account, and all other abortion procedures remained illegal. Such restrictions blocked the therapeutic abortion loophole and in no way made abortions more accessible, or affordable, or safer. What this bill did was make legal the, quote, status quo, end quote. Wealthy, upper-class, elite white women with means and status could still access abortions. And abortion access was uneven across the country. The average wait time was 8 weeks, and some provinces refused to provide services at all. It remained unavailable to the majority of rural individuals. Like many anti-abortion laws passed over the past decade in the U.S., these laws were put in place under the guise of protecting women's health, making the procedure safer, and preserving the life of the fetus. Really, these sanctions put in place a, quote, class-based system of abortion access, end quote. Lower income individuals, racialized individuals, and other marginalized populations were not represented in the hospital committees. Generally, upper-class, educated, white male doctors were the only ones having a say. Next, we're going to discuss two important components of abortion history in Canada. First, the trials of Dr. Henry Morgentaler, and second, the abortion caravan. Dr. Henry Morgentaler headed the social justice group called the Feminist Fellowship of Montreal and was involved in the original push for abortion decriminalization. Shortly after the Criminal Code reform of 1969, which in no way made abortion universally acceptable or accessible, Dr. Morgentaler opened an abortion clinic in Montreal. The police raided the facility in 1970, and Dr. Morgentaler was charged with, quote, several offenses, end quote. This began a series of trials as Morgentaler steadfastly stood by his belief that abortion should be accessible to anyone who needs it. He was first acquitted of the charges in 1973, but the Quebec Court of Appeal overturned the jury's verdict and found Morgentaler guilty in 1974. Though at that time he took his case to the Supreme Court of Canada, they upheld the court's original verdict, and Morgentaler was sentenced to 18 months in prison for, quote, conspiracy to commit an abortion, end quote. In 1976, after another trial, Morgentaler was acquitted. After his release, Dr. Morgentaler went on to open clinics in Quebec, Toronto, and Winnipeg. In 1983, the Winnipeg and Toronto clinics were raided, and Dr. Morgentaler and all other doctors involved were immediately charged with conspiracy to procure a miscarriage. At the 1984 trial, they were all acquitted, but the Ontario Attorney General appealed that acquittal, and in October 1985, a new trial was ordered. At that point, Dr. Morgentaler appealed his case to the Supreme Court of Canada, and on January 29, 1988, the Supreme Court of Canada declared that the abortion law of 1969 was unconstitutional on the grounds that it goes against Section 7 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, as it infringed on a person's right to security, liberty, privacy, and conscience. Now let's hop back to April 1970. This was when members of Vancouver Women's Caucus drove from Vancouver to Ottawa in 3 vehicles to protest Section 251 of the Criminal Code. This was the amendment which passed in 1969. This abortion caravan was deemed, quote, the first national feminist protest, end quote. By the time they arrived at Parliament Hill in Ottawa, the abortion caravan comprised of 500 women from across Canada. They held 2 days of protests, speeches, chants, and performances demanding equal reproductive rights for all women nationwide. However, government representatives refused to convene with any of the protesters. And so, 35 women went to the public galleries of the House of Commons and chained themselves to chairs, the goal being to disrupt Parliament. In this, they were successful, as it caused the first Parliament shutdown in Canadian history. Unfortunately, at that time, no immediate changes were made to Canada's laws in response to their efforts. However, the abortion caravan brought reproductive justice to the forefront of Canadian consciousness. In 1989, a year after the Supreme Court deemed the 1969 reform unconstitutional, the federal government proposed Bill C-43. This was yet another amendment to the criminal code. However, this time it would make any abortion illegal unless a doctor deemed, quote, the pregnancy as a threat to the woman's physical, mental, or psychological health, end quote. This caused massive protests countrywide as it put the power in the hands of the doctor rather than the patient. However, in May 1990, Bill C-43 passed the House of Commons anyway and went to the Canadian Senate for approval. The bill was only defeated by a tied vote. And so, in 1991, abortion gained the same status and regulation as any other medical procedure in Canada. In the following years, there were violent attacks against abortion providers and their clinics, including firebombing, arson, acid attacks, shooting, and stabbings. We will be discussing the anti-abortion movement later in this video. We are now going to discuss Prince Edward Island. PEI did not offer any kind of abortion services for 34 years. Shortly after the Supreme Court decision of 1988, PEI passed legislation opposing abortion services on the island. Over the past decades, they have continued to enforce various regulations to keep the island, quote, abortion-free, end quote. In 2016, Abortion Action Now PEI, a group of reproductive rights veterans, presented the province with a notice of legal challenge. Their argument was that the provincial restrictions, though not criminalizing the procedure, were a violation of individual rights to accessible and state-sponsored medical services. At that time, the only abortion service offered by the PEI provincial healthcare system was to refer those seeking abortion to hospital-based services off the island. Unfortunately, there was, quote, limited public funding for such services. So although the procedure itself is covered by provincial healthcare services, even out of province, the individuals who have to leave the island to access these services did not have additional funds for travel or accommodations. As many of those seeking abortions did so for an economic reason, this was a further barrier to them accessing services. When the government was confronted regarding the policy, the response received was that, quote, there is no desire to broaden the current abortion services. We believe the status quo is working. It became clear that the only grounds for the government's restrictions were based on individual beliefs of the political elites, rather than recognizing the healthcare needs of its women, gender non-binary, and transgendered citizens. AANPEI stated the policies were used to, quote, advance a particular conception of morality and restrict access to abortion as a socially undesirable or immoral practice. Abortions only became accessible to individuals physically on PEI at the end of 2016. Up until now, we've discussed that despite the legality of abortions in the 21st century, Canadian individuals seeking abortions still face barriers in access to services as a result of provincial regulations. But why is abortion such a controversial subject, and why is it so heavily regulated? I will be using the terms pro-choice and anti-abortion to discuss the two-sided debate regarding accessibility to abortions. The phrase pro-choice is disputed among feminist academics, as although the individual having the abortion is making the, quote, choice, end quote, to terminate their pregnancy, there are often extenuating factors over which they do not have control, such as safety, economic, and social conditions. Therefore, it is argued that having an abortion may not be a choice, but a matter of life or death, stability or poverty. Others argue that the choice rhetoric, in fact, works against reproductive rights to uphold the status quo of the patriarchy by making the woman both the victim and the aggressor. The term choice disregards the societal power imbalance which each of us experiences in our daily lives as a result of our sex, gender, sexuality, ability, race, class status, and other societal stratification factors. Choice assumes that we are, quote, free agents, end quote, both in the public and private sphere. Women have been oppressed in both the public and private sphere. LGBTQ2SAI plus persons have been oppressed in the public and private sphere. Racialized and Indigenous persons have been oppressed in the public and private sphere. When abortion is discussed using the current choice framework, it begins to fall within the realm of privacy and individual freedoms. However, within a neoliberal capitalist social structure, individuality and freedom are associated with lack of government interference. Such justifies governmental inaction, depriving individuals of state-supported health care. Not only that, but as decisions about the right to terminate pregnancy are made in the political and therefore public sphere, abortion cannot logically only be a private matter dealing with the body and sexuality. According to the Standing Committee on the Status of Women, women make up only 35% of all legislatures in Canada. There are currently only 4 openly LGBTQ2SAI plus MPs out of 338 seated representatives at the federal level. That equals to about 1%, and all 4 are white men. Abortion remains a matter of political discussion and therefore is a public matter. Second wave feminists coined the term, "the personal is political," and such applies here. I myself make the argument that abortion is both private and public, showing yet again that not everything fits into a simple either-or dichotomy. It is private as it remains a decision which a pregnant person should be able to make regarding their own body. It also remains a public matter as it continues to be regulated by political elites and is provided by state-regulated physicians. Whether it is legalized, decriminalized, or made illegal, abortion will remain a public matter as it is the government that decides if and when a person remains pregnant. Though the individual themselves makes the, quote, choice, end quote, to terminate, it is the government, be it provincial or federal, who decide if that termination will be safe, accessible, and affordable. These 3 variables put individuals seeking abortion at risk of imprisonment, physical and mental harm, and even death. Only by doing away with the private-public dichotomy of abortion and viewing it through the lens of necessary health care will there be real change in Canada. However, I cannot make this case without acknowledging the state of Canada's physical and mental health care system. However, that unfortunately I do not have time to discuss at length. Generally, anti-abortion groups claim their drive is about protecting babies or that their goals are religiously connected. These groups are also often tied to right-wing conservative politicians and the concept of traditional family values. But what are these values, and how do they tie to the abortion debate? Firstly, we're going to discuss the imposition of heteronormativity and the patriarchy in relation to reproductive rights. Affordable access to comprehensive reproductive care and abortions is closely tied to the matters of equality and social stratification. Women, queer, and trans individuals do not hold the same level of power in our society as most straight white men, cis men. Therefore, when these disempowered individuals are deprived of the autonomy to decide if and when to have children, they are pushed that much farther back from equal rights and equitable access to power. Such autonomy grants women and trans persons the opportunities to excel and succeed in the public sphere to the same level as males who cannot get pregnant. It gives them the power to conduct their lives as they see fit, which itself is a threat to the powers of the patriarchy. Marxist feminists believe that within capitalist, patriarchal social structures, a person with a uterus is placed in the role of producing and caring for future workers. Capitalists need low-wage workers to make profits, and those who could get pregnant are there not only to produce more workers, but also to provide the unpaid domestic labor to support those permitted to work in the public sphere, biological males. Thus, the option to end a pregnancy is a threat to profit and labor supply. By enforcing the male-female, woman-man dichotomy, compulsory heterosexuality is simultaneously also enforced. And it is these, quote, traditional roles, end quote, which many far-right politicians such as Stephen Harper, Ronald Reagan, Andrew Scheer, and Mike Pence wish society to return to, as they are the roles and norms which in turn empower them as white, straight men. Anti-abortion stances are also based on the two-sex, two-gender binary. Through this lens, anyone with a uterus is a woman, is meant to bear children, and is meant to remain in the private sphere. The ability to have an abortion empowers them to leave that private sphere. Enforcing pregnancy also enforces heteronormal values. It works to restrain individuals to their so-called, quote, biological sex framework. It works to trap women in the dependent role. As men, particularly white, cisgendered, straight men, are overrepresented in politics and are the ones making such laws, it remains these men who hold the power over persons with uteri, reducing them to objects for both sex and reproduction, while also punishing them for having sex outside of the heteronormal ideal. Penile vaginal coitus between a straight married couple for reproduction, i.e., to bring the man to orgasm. Placing race, sex, sexuality, and gender into dichotomous categories create the, quote, othering. In creating that othering, governmental and medical elites can in turn regulate and control people's bodies and maintain social stratification. It is this stratification that places them higher within social hierarchies and within the scope of concentrated social, economic, and political powers. Full reproductive rights include the right to bear children and raise children. It is well known that racialized, impoverished, and indigenous mothers are more frequently targeted by child protection agencies. In the case of residential schools and the 60 Scoop, Indigenous parents had their right to raise their children taken away completely by religious and government authorities. Through forcible and coerced sterilization, Indigenous women's rights to bear children were again taken away. Reproductive rights also encompass the right to safe, accessible, and non-biased health care, the right to affordable and accessible contraception, and the right to terminate a pregnancy for whatever reason. As the reason should not matter. Rather, it is the decision of the person themselves having the abortion that should matter. Anti-abortion lawmakers are also often the ones who oppose public health care, social services funding, and accessible contraception. And all of these factors impact individual reproductive rights. Anti-abortion politics have to do with compulsory heterosexuality, dominant subservient family structures, and relationships between man and wife, and parents and children, as well as encompassing traditional gender roles. It is argued that our public sphere is heteronormative. As such, the monogamous and procreative ideal, women seeking abortion, is not fulfilling her role as a mother and as a wife. Anti-abortion politics also have to do with the possibility that women and girls could be sexual beings in their own right rather than simple sex objects. It has to do with aligning the sex lives of women and trans persons to the heterosexual norm, which in turn privileges cisgendered biological males. To remove safe, accessible abortion simultaneously attacks the rights and freedoms of women, queer and trans persons, racialized persons, and impoverished persons. The focus of this project is on Canada. However, it should be noted that America is our closest trade partner, closest political partner, and closest geographically. Canada shares some amount of culture and media with the United States, and we've seen this with the anti-abortion rhetoric and the rise of the Canadian political right. Canada has had its fair share of religious controversy, including the actions of the Catholic Church regarding residential schools and the coerced conversion of Indigenous persons, and also the issues surrounding sexual violence towards women and children by church leaders. Conservative Christians, generally evangelical Protestants and Catholics, generally take the stance that their interpretation of the Bible and church dogma reject abortion. However, such interpretations are those of white male church elites rather than those who would have a reason to seek an abortion. There are also often so-called traditional interpretations, and therefore are based on historical biases. The anti-abortion movement's membership is largely made up of conservative Christians, both Catholic or Protestant. Some of these conservative Christians are also members of the larger Christian right, which is closely allied with the political New Right. Members of the anti-abortion movement have also shown to have ties to white supremacists and anti-queer and trans rights groups. In religious anti-abortion rhetoric, the issue is framed as one of morality. Religious rhetoric holds power over the beliefs and loyalties of their followers, and therefore, in the church suggesting that those seeking an abortion are immoral and, quote, murdering babies, end quote, such spawns further support for the anti-abortion movement. The issue of morality is a powerful one. As seen historically, cultural and social beliefs of right and wrong can drastically shape individual behaviors, especially when it regards such an intimate subject as abortion. It allows individuals from drastically different personal and religious backgrounds to rally around one set issue, while simultaneously an issue that simultaneously involves sex, sexuality, definition of who is human, and the very process of creating life. The more personal and sensitive a topic, the more controversial it becomes. The Catholic Church hierarchy is in and of itself patriarchal. Church leaders, from priests to the Pope, are primarily male. Although women can become nuns, they hold little status, emphasis is on their physical purity, and they are deemed servants of the church. Women in the Catholic Bible are also cast in a different light. Mary, mother of Jesus, is a young virgin girl who is used as an incubator for God. She is therefore celebrated only for her fertility and her reproductive abilities. To become pregnant and give birth were not her choice, but rather a role thrust upon her. Her sexuality, or potential as an autonomous sexual being, are removed from the picture completely. When God himself is said to be male, and the father and the patriarch of the church's followers. To the church, feminism and women's freedom are a threat to not only the societal patriarchy, but also the patriarchal structures of the church itself. In turn, abortion, which frees women from their biological role, stands as a threat to that patriarchy. In turn, we've seen anti-feminist backlash aimed at abortion and all sexual freedoms, including contraception, homosexuality, and premarital sex. These offer alternatives to the traditional family structures in which the man, as husband and follower, is head of the home and the patriarch of the family. Religious fundamentalisms, the patriarchal church dogmas which exclude women from positions of power, existing historical prejudices, and the nature of social race and class inequalities make abortion not only a controversial issue, but one that is also political. By examining social scientific research into the impact of abortion restrictions, it becomes clear that such laws are not in the best interests of those who have the potential to get pregnant, nor of the unwanted fetuses brought to term. Rather, it becomes evidence that claims regarding protecting women's health or working in the best interests of the unborn are covers for the patriarchal ideology of the conservative religious political right. These laws have instead shown to increase maternal and fetal mortality rates, increase occurrences of unsafe and illegal abortion procedures, and disproportionately negatively impact Black, Indigenous people of color and those living in poverty. The data shows that the only thing consistently proven to reduce the demand for abortions are affordable health care, comprehensive sex education, and access to affordable contraception. Anti-abortion politicians, primarily white males, are generally ones who also enforce the neoliberal ideals of self-responsibility and hold opposition to social welfare programs. These programs support the very persons who they are in turn forcing into continued pregnancy. Such politicians are shown, either for political or ideological reasons, to oppose federal programs against domestic violence, family planning organizations, birth control access for youth, affirmative action programs, subsidized child care and healthcare systems, LGBTQ2SAI+ rights, and anything else that would be related to, quote, encouraging divorce, equality of the sexes, or women's work outside the home, end quote. In the 1970s, second-wave feminism, though flawed in many ways, was beginning to create drastic social change and was perceived as threatening traditional conservative values. Those empowered by the existing system recognized the threat of feminism, civil rights, and the LGBTQ2SAI+ liberation movement. Abortion would provide those previously without the opportunity to reach such equal power status. Right-wing politicians see the power in the government controlling and regulating the private sphere to restore the previous status quo. This status quo consists of traditional values and familial roles, encouraging women to remain as caregivers and restricting sexual freedoms. Criminalizing and restricting abortions is only one of the tools used to return to such times. Radical feminists recognize that by regulating bodies and taking control over the reproductive labor of women, the state is attempting to restore the powers of the patriarchy in political, economic, and social spheres. For capitalists, this ideology rests on the unpaid arrogation of women's time, physical labors, bodies, and the products thereof. This appropriation reduces those with uteruses to the status of a thing to be used and abused to the advantage of those with privilege. Religion provides a, quote, apocalyptic framework which validates moral absolutism, end quote. Religious rhetoric acts as the ideological basis for anti-abortion organization. However, this framework remains political. Controlling abortion controls how decisions are made and who holds the power in the public and private spheres, in the economic market, the political and social states, in the household and the family, and within the church. As Canada is meant to be a multicultural but secular state, religious beliefs should not be acting as backing for political policy. Political elites who use their positions to control the lives and sexualities of those who need abortions either do not realize or do not care about the double-blind impact of abortion restrictions and social services cuts. White, middle, and upper-class individuals are generally able to access such procedures regardless of its legal status. Abortion restrictions target Black, Indigenous, people of color, marginalized, and impoverished women and trans individuals. When one accounts for the economic and social impacts of unplanned pregnancy and raising a child, it becomes understandable why some choose abortion. Maternity or paternity leave are not available to some, and even so, employment insurance only offers a little over half of one's previous wage. Single parents may not be able to afford childcare, and income assistance provides a meager monthly income. Some are unable to work while pregnant for health reasons, and not all jobs offer paid medical leave or health insurance. Car seats, cribs, clothes, and diapers, all necessary for raising a baby in the 21st century, are expensive. This is one area where restricted abortion access disproportionately impacts one population over another. Wealthier individuals may be able to support an unplanned pregnancy, but for someone who is already low income or who already has children to care for, an unplanned pregnancy consists as a crisis, and they could be targeted by Child Protective Services. Women who do work outside the home are still oppressed by the sexual divisions of labor in patriarchal society. Because of the gendered expectations, the majority of childcare and child-rearing duties fall to the female of the family, meaning it is women who generally must work both part-time and in precarious positions to accommodate caring for children. They are statistically paid less and are promoted less often than their male counterparts. Some must drop out of school or leave the workforce to complete their childcare duties, resulting in devaluation of their work, both due to low levels of education and general sex oppression. The majority of individuals living in poverty are women, in particular single mothers and Black or Indigenous people of color. This is a phenomenon referred to as the feminization of poverty. The concerns about the crisis of family values or traditions are in fact the fear of loss of gendered, racial, and class power hierarchies. Abortion is not simply an aspect of social welfare or healthcare. It is, above all, a condition of sexual and economic liberation. Access to abortion changes how power is exercised within the public and private spheres, the economy, the state, the home, and the church. Legal, equitable, affordable, and accessible abortions pose a threat to multiple social power imbalances: white supremacy, colonization, class-based social stratification, heteronormativity, and cisgendered public spheres. The patriarchy encompasses all these factors, giving the most power to wealthy, straight, cisgendered white men. Thus, abortion access must sit on the forefront of the social justice movement. Full reproductive and sexual freedoms for all women, non-binary, and trans persons would disrupt and have the potential to dismantle the social systems that enable racism, transphobia, homophobia, poverty, cultural genocide, and gender inequality.